Thank you for joining us on a Sunday afternoon. I landed this morning after a week of vacation, and that was it was an early morning this morning, but that's okay. Then I got up here and realized that we're all competing against the Red Sox game this afternoon. For what that's worth, I'm not sure who they're playing. Quite honestly, I'm not even sure how their season's going, but Mariners, okay. Well, anyway, so welcome, thank you. My name is Kevin Stine. I lead our applied cybersecurity division at NIST. We have a very kind of a keen, laser-sharp focus on the application of standards and best practices and technologies to help organizations solve cybersecurity and privacy challenges. And a pretty significant portion of that portfolio, if you will, is in the identity and access management space. I think most folks are probably familiar. If you're not familiar with NIST history in identity and access management, I would imagine most are definitely aware of our most recent kind of landmark effort, if you will, the update to 800-63, version 3 that was issued about a year ago, actually a year ago, just a day or two ago, I think. What I was hoping to do today, and I think my colleagues from NIST will go into a lot more detail over the rest of the afternoon if you're able to stick with us for the duration, is to really talk about 863, but put it in the context of the broader activities at NIST with respect to not just cybersecurity and privacy, but really identity and access management, kind of that broader portfolio. My hope is to really just kind of put it in that context and really just kind of scratch the surface of some of these areas, you know, where we've come from, where we are today, and a little bit about where we plan to go. And then we'll have some more kind of some deeper discussions in some of those specific areas over the rest of the afternoon. So from our broader cybersecurity and privacy portfolio, identity is certainly a key component of our efforts at NIST. I would say it's not just pure identity and access management, but certainly identity and access management in the context of a lot of different initiatives of national interest and national importance. So we'll definitely get into a good bit of that. And I think over the course of my talk, definitely tee up some of the sessions and the discussions that we'll have over the rest of the afternoon. Success, okay, good. So we're moving now. So NIST has we've been in the cybersecurity space for, gosh, over, I guess we're going on close to 50 years now, going back to the late 60s, early 70s, with the kind of the development of the data encryption standard. You know, prior to kind of early 1970s, cryptographic technologies were primarily military-grade application. And in the late 60s, early 70s, you know, the financial institutions began to deploy essentially, you know, ATM machines. You know, these little kiosks in public spaces or less protected spaces that will dole out money, you know, to their customers and their clients. And the financial sector, you know, determined a need for, you know, a mechanism, some sort of, you know, capability to protect data from these ATM machines out in the field and in unprotected locations back to their data centers, you know, to protect those financial transactions and the customer information that was being transmitted back and forth. And cryptographic technologies was essentially the core requirement of that. So through collaboration with NIST, with organizations in industry like IBM and with the financial sector working in standards bodies, we created the data encryption standard. And certainly over the last 50 years, you know, our portfolio has grown. It's changed pretty dramatically along with the changes in technology, definitely with the evolving threat landscape as well. So our portfolio has grown and evolved with those too. From a broad perspective, our purpose, if you will, at NIST with respect to cybersecurity is to cultivate trust in information and in technology through cybersecurity. And we do that primarily through advances in standards, in technology, and in measurement science. You know, NIST as an agency, U.S. government agency, non-regulatory, is a measurement agency at heart, you know, going back to our roots in the early 1900s. When I think about our cybersecurity portfolio and privacy portfolio, kind of spans, you know, across that life cycle thread of the early stage foundational research all the way through to the applied engineering. You know, how do we take, you know, the results of that research, you know, work with that information through standards bodies, through activities, integrate it in a way to actually prove out some of these example solutions, engineering solutions, and then seeing that through to a more, what we tend to think of as kind of technology transfer, transitioning the results of the research and the engineering activities and standards into the hands of the practitioners that can then take it and use it in the context of their missions and business objectives. So among all the technical and managerial and kind of process and policy and people-oriented things, there's kind of a common theme or principle that's kind of pulled throughout all that, and you'll definitely get a sense of that over the course of today as well. Is this notion of risk management, this really grounded in this principle of risk management, helping to seek to help organizations improve their ability to manage risk in the context of their missions and business objectives. Whether you're a small healthcare provider in a rural setting, or you're a large financial institution, or you're an online retailer with hundreds of millions of customers and clients located all around the world. We believe that kind of this notion of risk management is definitely applicable, and then having that strong foundation of standards, of best practices, and really a solid technical foundation is absolutely critical. I guess when I hear the beep, it's successful, or I could look right there. So our identity and access management activities are not quite as old as our cryptographic activities, but definitely one of the long-standing programs and areas of focus that we have at NIST, dating back to, at least by my understanding, into the early 1990s with work around smart cards and crypto for authentication. Certainly over the years, including increasing in the late 90s around PKI, having some different policy drivers coming out specific to the federal government, particularly MO 404, OMB's memorandum 0404 around identity and access management, which really was one of the foundational drivers for our work in 800-63, the first version of that back in 2004. In 2005, we had Homeland Security Presidential Directive 12, HSPD 12, that called for essentially what is now today personal identity verification standard and suite of guidelines that I don't have my badge with me, but kind of if you're either a Fed or familiar with federal operations and activities for using your smart card for logical and physical access, definitely have the physical access part down pretty well, I think. Still, even since 2005, still increasing use of logical that card for logical access as well. 2011 saw a pretty significant focus on NIST taking on the National Program Office for the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, or NSTIC. We definitely learned a lot over that program, which was intended to be a 5-year program, and we've been able to establish very strong relationships with industry, with some very innovative and creative organizations, partner and kind of collaborative organizations that we've worked with in industry and standards bodies, not just domestically but all around the world as well. And we've been able to take what we've learned through those engagements and kind of feed those into kind of our next generation of activities that we'll talk a little bit about over the course of the next few minutes and several sessions. In 2013, we had an update to 800-63, not quite a monumental update, if you will, more of a minor update. Really, about a year ago, though, we issued, as a result of probably, 18 months or more of, really significant collaboration and coordination with the public, federal agencies, and all interested stakeholders. It's really the pretty dramatic update to 800-63 Rev 2 into Rev 3. And we'll go into a little bit more detail on this. With that history as a backdrop, I think our roots of our identity and access management program today are really born out of our foundational research activities that have been happening, constantly since probably the early 90s. They were expanded through the establishment of NSTIC, and they continue to evolve, not just with new and different types of authorities that we have, but also the ever-changing technology and threat landscape as well. So sometimes I just try to use very simple words, not for your benefit, but probably more so for mine, to really try to capture what are we focusing on with respect to our different activities at NIST. In this case, focusing on what are we doing in the identity and access management space. I try to boil it down, and this is probably, trying to boil the ocean with a simple, broad phrase like this, but ensuring the right people, things, and processes have the right access to the right resources at the right time. Definitely a kind of a system and a life cycle view that's built into this. It's also important to, and I have some of those key words highlighted there in the bolder blue text. For so long, a lot of our work, I would say a lot of the work of the community has focused for many years on the people identity. And that's great, and that has to continue. People are absolutely a critical part of systems, of different types of transactions. Whatever, regardless of what sector or business process you're participating in. But with, more and more devices and things coming online, being able to identify and authenticate and kind of manage the authorization for those types of things is absolutely critical. And I would say even at a more granular level, the processes that these things perform. If you're, an AMI, kind of the smart grid metering interface on the side of a house, you have different processes that are operating on that particular piece of technology, that thing. How do you know, how can you understand and kind of manage the identity and the rights of those processes on that device when it's interacting not just kind of upstream with the grid, but downstream into your home network or your home energy setup. So those types of things are absolutely critical, and that's an area that both, not just the people, but increasingly the devices and the processes, or the things and the processes are areas that we're focusing on significantly at NIST. A lot of drivers and motivators that will kind of inform and influence our activities. Certainly there's longstanding policies and pieces of law and legislation that as executive branch agencies in the federal government we will continue to meet, and they will continue to inform our activities. Certainly if you're tracking the federal identity and access management space these days, OMB, our Office of Management and Budget, has, I guess the comment period closed, but there was a draft identity policy out for comment, and I think that closed, a little bit over a month or so ago. So that, as that policy evolves and is issued in final eventually, that will certainly have an impact on our activities as well. And I'd say a lot of related programs, and we'll talk more about some of these related programs, but there's a lot of related programs within our kind of portfolio of things, such as the cybersecurity framework and our work at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence and our privacy engineering activities that are going to be informed and influenced by our identity activities and vice versa. So there's kind of this the strong relationship between these, between all these different dimensions. I would say, though, despite all these intersecting disciplines and opportunities to kind of bring the great activities, not just of us, but kind of the community and the identity space, and bring those into the fold within these other areas of national interest and importance, is really kind of holding those core principles, which really date back maybe even before NSTIC, but they certainly were highlighted through the stand-up of NSTIC of security and privacy, interoperability, and usability, which is an absolutely critical piece. So I think about our identity work today in kind of these 5 broader buckets, and I'll talk a little bit about each one of these, not so much on conformance testing. There's a specific example of some work that we're doing in conformance testing space, or particularly around personal identity verification, not just to FIPS 201, kind of the foundational standard for PIV, but really to the implementation guidelines, 800-73, for example. When I throw things out like 800 series docs and things like that and FIPS in the context of NIST, does everybody understand what those are? Do I need to kind of, okay, we're good? Okay, just kind of throw that, taxonomy flag if you want any time, and I can back up. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these, but I think we definitely have research activities. Some have been longstanding, some are newer areas that we're starting to focus on, and we'd love to get feedback from you, not just today, but as we move forward in any kind of way. Standards development, not just kind of maintaining the body of work, both standards and guidelines that we've issued at NIST and new things that we may issue as we move forward, but also our participation in international standards bodies, and quite honestly, your participation in those types of bodies, international and national standards activities, and different industry fora as well. And then practical applications. How do you take all these standards, all these guidelines and best practices, new technologies, the things that folks in industry are developing to address specific challenges? How do you demonstrate that we can build out example solutions to some of the business challenges that many of your organizations or your customers or clients are facing today? Being able to prove those out and share those much more broadly. So I want to touch on just a few, again, kind of intent here is to just scratch the surface on some things that we're thinking about. So on the research side, blockchain, I think there's a tremendous amount of hype, if you will, around blockchain. I think depending on the conversation you're having, blockchain will solve. We kind of have a little game in this, how many minutes into a conversation can you go without having the word blockchain pop up? The fact that we made it 20 minutes is actually pretty impressive. And that's probably just because I'm talking. I'm sure maybe somebody else would have brought that up. I'd say where we are generally with blockchain, not even in the context of identity and access management, but generally with blockchain is really trying to demystify it. Let's boil it down to, get beyond the hype and the use of the term blockchain. Okay, what is it? What are some of the opportunities that we see? What are some of the challenges we see or we're hearing about? Are there potential use cases or example scenarios where blockchain would be a good approach, a good tool, a good technology that could be brought into this? We've had many interactions with other federal agencies that have particular focus on a sector in the broader digital economy. For example, with HHS on opportunities to utilize blockchain in different healthcare applications, particularly in the healthcare and increasing cybersecurity and privacy and trust in those applications as well. From an identity perspective, within the last several months, we issued a guideline on, I call it demystifying blockchain, but that's not the official title. But within that document, we talk about blockchain and trying to get beyond the hype into really practically what it is and how could it be used. And we do talk a little bit about opportunities for its use in identity management or in the context of identity management frameworks, particularly those frameworks that would require or benefit from distributed ledgers, which is really what blockchain is, but not so much as the standard for identity management system. So I'm not sure that we are quite there yet with respect to blockchain being or serving that role specifically as the identity management standard or process. But there are certainly opportunities where it could be brought in to improve identity and access management activities, particularly where distributed ledgers could be beneficial. Continuous authentication, kind of this dynamic risk-based authentication, understanding different types of kind of user attributes, kind of behavioral attributes, for example, of an individual, could potentially include geolocation, those types of things. We're particularly interested in continuous authentication. I know there's a lot of examples. I think many of the ones I've heard about have been in the financial sector, where there's a lot of increased interest and activity around deployments of continuous authentication or things like it. So we're particularly interested in that as both a research challenge and opportunity that we want to focus on, but also let's get a better sense of how folks are using this type of approach today or trying to use this type of approach today practically in their here and now business challenges. And what are the opportunities that we can, how can we better support those activities, whether it's in the form of, informing that research agenda or practical implementations, for example, that we can take on. Privacy preserving authentication using crypto, kind of this notion of minimal disclosure or selective attribute disclosure, bringing cryptography into the fold. There's always been a very strong, and I think going back to the early stages of our identity work in the early 90s, kind of marrying these two passions of NIST with respect to cryptography and identity and access management. And there will continue to be, as those two fields or disciplines evolve in parallel, there are obviously opportunities for convergence as well. And then certainly authentication and IoT, and we talked a little bit about that already. In the standard space, So the top line of our activities here is just leadership and participation in international standards activities and in industry forums. And I think the session right after this one, my colleague Dave Temashok is going to go into a lot more detail on our standards activities. Let's say maybe a few things top line. I see folks taking pictures. I'm not sure. I mean, you feel free to take pictures, and I think we can also share the slides as well. So we'll figure out what the process is to do that later if you're interested in them. Definitely, we participate and lead in many international standards activities. Much of our focus is helping to coordinate, to align, and to explain the U.S. government's identity management activities, not just our standards, but kind of other areas of interest related to identity and access management. We think that, strong participation, and we feel this about all of our standards engagements, not just in the identity space, but definitely, having this type of engagement in the international standard space hopefully lead to greater international alignment for cross-border assurance and recognition of trust. We think that's a very foundational piece and capability. We think having this type of kind of this greater alignment across international standards could really be a nice platform and really lead to greater industry products and services that can be more efficient or effective at meeting a variety of different requirements that may come from different, not just vertical sectors, but certainly in different locales around the globe, and do so in a much more efficient way and increase security as well. And I'll save more of the detail, let Dave kind of go into more detail in the next session. So we issue a lot of guidelines in NIST. When I talk about guidelines, it's typically in the context of our special publication 800 series. We also have 1800 series now, and I'll talk a little bit about those later, particularly in the identity space. We've issued several guidelines, 800 series guidelines over the many years in the identity and access management space. Many of those have been around the personal identity verification standard, the PIV standard, 873 earlier as one example of kind of the technical kind of interoperability standards for the actual smart card for PIV, for which there's a conformance activity associated with it. I'd say that maybe the flagship guideline that we've issued now in its third revision, third release issued last June 2017 is 800-63. Very simply put, the purpose of 863 is to provide those technical requirements for federal agencies that are implementing digital identity services, and with the audience of users interacting with federal services, with government services. With that said, and I think this applies to any and all of our standards and practices, it's not just, the federal agencies are not just the only, users or adopters of our resources. While they may have to, it's required by law and OMB policy, we frequently see many in industry adopting these as well voluntarily. And that's a sign of success, if you will, for us. And impact. And we learn a lot through that as well, through your implementation experiences and really understanding how our resources are being helpful or could be improved to help you address your challenges as well. This update to 63-3 was broken down into, instead of one significant document, broken down into 4 volumes. The base volume provides the digital identity guidelines, those foundational guidelines, and then volumes A, B, and C as depicted up there. And we try to, through each of these volumes, kind of provide very clear distinctions between the normative and the informative language that's in those. So every time we issue a guideline, any effort at NIST, any output from NIST, we always use very open and transparent and inclusive processes through multiple comment periods, hosting workshops, just different ways to engage. I mean, different, events and organizations similar to this one here as well. And we did that with 63-3, and we also introduced kind of a new twist to it as well. In an attempt to kind of take advantage of different types of tools and approaches that others in industry frequently use. In this context, we use GitHub as a platform to not only share the document as it was being developed, but really as a way to get the get the feedback from the community and really have that conversation in almost a live manner. So we could get the feedback, discussions could be started around, a particular comment thread that someone had, and we could do, in many cases, kind of live adjudication of the comments with interested stakeholders and participants. So while we did follow our traditional process of issuing a guideline for public comment, kind of the traditional PDF route, if you will, we did complement that with this more iterative kind of live approach. And I think that that was tremendously valuable for us. I think it also brought in a whole new set of stakeholders that may not have been involved as actively, if you will, in past engagements with NIST and our kind of inclusive development process. So that was particularly rewarding, and I think it's something that we'll continue to try to do with other efforts as well. So there were some pretty significant enhancements to 63-3 over previous versions, and this was, simply put, intended to help kind of raise the bar on identity and access management. I think in addition to some general updates to kind of updated terminology to clarify language across the identity space, there were some key areas that we focused on, throughout the document. And I'll kind of highlight these real quick, and then we'll talk about some of the things that we've learned over the last year as organizations have sought to implement 63-3, and then talk a little bit about where we're going based on that feedback. So assurance levels. So if you were familiar with previous versions of 63 and OMB's MO404 policy, there were 4 levels of assurance, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We broke that model down into, instead of having kind of 4 levels, we essentially made it into a kind of a 3-by-3 matrix. Not quite that simple, but where we focus on different levels of assurance for identity, proofing, authenticators, and federation. So in some ways, this really is really an example of that risk-based approach that we try to infuse into all of our activities. Going beyond just kind of here are the 4 levels to, okay, there's different characteristics, different criteria, different considerations that an organization may choose to think about as they're making their determinations with respect to proofing, with respect to authenticators, with respect to federated assertions. And those may be different depending on your business processes, your threat environment, those types of things, as well as the evolution of technologies and different approaches. So really trying to bring that risk-based approach and that flexible approach into 63-3. Privacy, an area that I think the roots of our privacy work in this broadly really stem from the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. Certainly had some other drivers along the way, but privacy considerations were really enhanced in a significant way within 63-3, and I think one of the sessions this afternoon we'll talk a little bit more detail about our privacy efforts. Pretty dramatic overhaul to the identity proofing discussion and treatment within 63-3. And I think one of the areas where we've gotten a lot of very positive feedback and exciting feedback from folks in industry, at least that I've heard, is around this notion. It's almost an oxymoron of remote in-person proofing. So the notion that to proof someone now, like in 63 there we go, in and out again. It doesn't necessarily require you and I to be sitting in the same room to do that proofing. While there are some specific, well captured and clearly captured constraints and technical requirements that go into that, you can actually, in 63-3 really there is support for that remote in-person proofing. One of the things from the federal operations perspective, there was a lot of interest in, the way it was described to me was as PIV cards, for the proofing process for the PIV cards. When you think about the need to have the in-person proofing and that processes, there's a pretty significant kind of capital investment that can go out and actually manage these different proofing stations, for example. And this is in some ways a pretty dramatic opportunity to increase not just some efficiency into the process, but some cost savings as well. So there's a lot of excitement there. I think folks, and as we were developing the draft of 63.3, there was definitely a lot of coverage and a lot of very public and excited debate on the merits of knowledge-based verification and the use of SMS as well. And we've certainly, those are pretty significant changes within 63-3. So we definitely learned a lot, not just through the development of 63.3, but certainly we've heard a lot from using organizations, not just federal agencies, but others over the last years. They've kind of dug into 63.3 with respect to their implementations. Maybe I'll kind of talk a little bit about some of these. I think maybe the top line point that I've heard is really the implementations are challenged by what is practical and achievable today. That is most frequently in the context of proofing. So there are some of the way we talk about proofing and proofing requirements and considerations within 63-3 are very difficult and challenging to implement. I think there's tremendous benefit we hear about the flexible risk-based approach that's. Is that better? I can hear it going in and out. Apologize. The different levels of assurance, significant flexibility brought there at the same time. I'm not. And you're not here. Oh, in and out. Okay, I won't move. Sometimes I get tethered and I just want to walk. So having the flexibility is great, but at the same time, it gives you flexibility, and sometimes organizations, they just want, what is the answer, or give me just the bare minimum set of options. And that's something that we hear quite frequently. So while we've gone from 4 levels to kind of a, not quite this simply a 3x3 matrix that gives you lots of choices, challenges, it gives you lots of choices. So definitely opportunities for clarification there based on what we've heard from folks. I think the other dimension of kind of the levels of assurance that we've heard about is you can make a risk-based determination within your organization for your organization on the appropriate level of assurance given the transactions and the systems that you're operating and the business that you're conducting. Will other organizations accept your risk-based determination for those levels of assurance when you seek to establish a trust relationship with them? Don't know. They may come to a different conclusion with respect to their risk-based decision. So I think there are certainly some opportunities and some challenges with respect to that as well. At least that's some of the feedback that we've heard. With respect to PIV, we've definitely heard that there's a need to bring greater alignment. I'm really just going to be a statue and just not move. There's a need to have greater alignment between the PIV standards and practices and guidelines and the requirements in 800-63. We've heard specifically in the area of proofing that there's a little bit of misalignment there. So that's something that we're digging into in a fair amount of detail with the folks that are kind of the stewards of the PIV standards and practices as well, to understand where there may be some challenges there, some conflicts, and kind of deconflict in that way. Increasingly over the last few years, in addition to kind of developing the standards and developing the best practices and working with the industry in a very collaborative way to understand the state of technology, how things are being used, what are the opportunities for partnership to kind of bring these things to a much wider and broader audience. There's certainly a value in understanding kind of practical example implementations or practical applications of these standards and best practices and technical approaches in the context of specific missions and business objectives. And I guess about a little bit over 5 years ago, we established, with the help of our congressional overseers, our National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, or the NCCOE. I'll talk about it in the context of the center. To really take on that particular, Okay, to take on that particular problem, which is, how do we accelerate the adoption of, cybersecurity tools and standards and best practices and technologies to help solve some of these business challenges? And that's really what the focus of the center is today. We do that through, certainly informed by our broader research agenda and activities at NIST, but definitely in very strong partnership and collaboration with folks in industry, hundreds and hundreds of organizations that are participating in very formal and less formal ways with us at the center. And I'd say increasingly our work is being kind of informed and influenced by identity challenges as well. And you'll see kind of a related, and here's kind of a sampling of the identity-related projects that we have going on at the center now. Many of these are kind of identity and access management applied in a specific context, for example, in the energy sector or in public safety and first responders, for example, with some of the unique challenges that they may have. How do you make cybersecurity real in those contexts? And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those in one of the later sessions, I think, with Bill Fisher, who's leading many of those activities. For those federally focused folks, this notion of derived PIV, so the notion that you have your smart card, which I don't have with me, but pretend I do. You have your smart card, your PIV card there. How can you kind of derive the strength of that card and really the processing that is behind that, the strong processes behind that to have that same strength, on a mobile device or on a mobile platform. So deriving the strength from that card and process it and use it in new and different ways. So a lot of exciting things that are happening there. And I'd say many of we're fortunate to have many partners and collaborators in the industry, and particularly in the identity space. I think many of the organizations that are here in pretty significant ways have or have worked with us at the center as well. So certainly a lot more opportunities there as we move forward. I mentioned earlier that the identity is really just a core capability for our cybersecurity and privacy program at NIST. And it's informing and kind of infusing into a lot of different areas as well. I think for those of you that follow the cybersecurity framework, originally issued in February 2014, a pretty, version 1.1 was issued just a few months ago. Significant increase in the treatment of identity and access management and authorization within the cybersecurity framework, really taking advantage of the maturing body of work in the standard space and in different approaches that have happened over the last several years since the first version of the framework was released. So a lot of excitement there, and really a recognition that identity continues to evolve as well and mature in a helpful way. Mentioned the privacy engineering work a little bit earlier, and I know that Ellen will talk a little bit more about that in one of the later sessions. Cybersecurity for IoT, we recently stood up this program as a way to kind of bring some coordination and consistency to all the IoT related things that we're doing at NIST, either directly or related to IoT. And identity is a critical part of that, both the things and the processes. We talked a little bit about the public safety communications and the smart grid activities as examples. But again, I think identity is such a core kind of foundational capability in our program that pretty much anything that we are focusing on, there is an identity dimension to it. And we'll continue to kind of explore those as well. So a lot of the things that I've talked about, we're going to continue to do those. The standards and guidelines work, including in the personal identity verification. We will continue to engage in those ways and in ways that the community in general feels will be helpful and positive to your efforts as well. We're going to continue to build out example implementations at and through the NCCOE. We seek to work with any type of industry sector organization to address not just through example solutions, not just specific example solutions for your particular business challenges, but really opportunities where we can have cross-cutting solutions and capabilities that can really have a broad impact on the community as a whole. Cybersecurity framework, as that evolves and as identity evolves, we'll continue to see greater alignment of those resources and activities, really to use the framework the spotlight that the framework has on it to really enhance and amplify the great things that are happening in this space as well. And then, I've talked about the other two really new models and approaches, continuing on with the blockchain research and other types of approaches, including continuous authentication. We are always, we have tremendous deep technical expertise, and not just in specific dimensions of cybersecurity and privacy, but really in the context of the application of those things. But we are always in kind of learning and listening mode as well. And I would say, listening is one of our key differentiators that we have in comparison to many other organizations. We want to engage with you, so not just over the course of today, but certainly in any additional opportunities where you have areas of interest, where there's an area of mutual interest. We'd love to have a discussion with you to understand the opportunities and challenges that you see, and then we can work with you to determine the best way that NIST can bring our resources to bear. Certainly welcome your collaborations and input, and definitely any questions that you may have now, before we turn it over to some of my colleagues. Yes?
Nice presentation so far. Thank you.
Sure.
So, wanted to briefly touch upon the previous standards which talk about use of text messaging as an additional form of authentication and where we are today. So, is that still a reliable method of additional authentication?
I think we talk about SMS in the context of restricted use. That's the term that we've been using, or limited use? Yes. Yeah. So very restricted, I think, in different with different considerations, but certainly not. Dave, if you want to add anything to that.
Recognizing that in the future we provide the notice that SMS might be further restricted in future publications. Sure.
We continue to seek feedback on what the specific challenges are that organizations have. I think we've certainly heard a lot. While we don't intend to, I think for a while there was this notion that we were going to issue additional guidance. I think I would kind of describe it as more implementation resources. As we learn more, what are we hearing? What are some opportunities that we can clarify? And that may be through, for example, things like errata updates to the actual publications. It could be through companion implementation resources, those types of things. And I think increasingly we can look to the NCCOE as a potential place to, build out some example implementations. Sure.
You mentioned the financial sector is one of the vertical markets. Are you seeing anything else? For example, anti-fraud, account recovery as a useful technique that could help?
So, I mean, from what I've heard in the discussions I've had, it's primarily been in the financial sector, implementations or interest there as kind of a viable solution for them. I'm sure there are others and other, ways that it can be used, or other types of capabilities to achieve the same end result. So, yeah. Nope. One more.
So I was actually going to ask, can you enlighten me on this continuous authentication? I'm thinking it's not bombarding the user with OTPs all the time. So can you say something about it?
No, yeah. So it's actually it's actually very passive. So it should be actually less burdensome and interactive on the user, and more taking advantage of kind of the characteristics and attributes and activities of the user themselves. For example, I mean, some of the examples that folks talk about frequently are the way the user interacts with the technology in terms of the interactions with the keyboard or the mobile device and those types of things. So a lot of different types of behavioral analytics that could be taken advantage of to determine is this the user, is this the same user over an extended period of time. Well, thank you very much. I think quick 5-minute break to transition to the next speaker. So thank you, I appreciate it.